At every military base, there's someone the soldiers forget to salute. At Redstone Forward Logistics, that someone was Helen Carter. She wore no rank, carried no sidearm, and didn't sit at any planning table. To most of the officers, she was just the lady with the sandwich tray. Small in stature, soft-spoken, and always in motion, Helen moved through the base like a whisper. She woke up at 4 a.m. sharp every single day, preparing meals for returning special operations teams. She knew who liked extra pickles, who had allergies, and who hadn't eaten in 14 hours. But no one ever asked about her. They just called her Miss Sandwich, sometimes with a smirk, sometimes with a snort. One young lieutenant once joked, "Bet she used to cook in the field." Maybe that tag around her neck's from an ex-boyfriend. That tag, a silver military ID chain, had letters so worn down, no one could read them anymore. No one cared to. Helen never flinched. She just nodded politely and returned to the kitchen. Until one Thursday morning, everything changed. It started like any other day. Helen walked into the operations briefing room with a tray of coffee and turkey melts, just as the officers were reviewing drone footage from a recon gone bad. The screen showed Bravo team, cornered in a narrow ridge, pinned by incoming fire. The mood was tense, but still casual. One of the younger officers cracked a joke about late breakfast, and someone whistled when Helen walked in. But Helen didn't respond. She was frozen, eyes locked on the screen. Then she whispered, "That's my unit." The laughter died instantly. Major Donald turned to her, frowning. "What did you just say?" Helen stepped forward slowly. The silver tag around her neck caught the projector light. Her voice steady now. "That man on the screen. His name's Sergeant Matt Evans. I pulled him out of Fog Ridge with a stomach wound that wouldn't stop bleeding." Another officer began searching records. Moments later, a file was found. It read Carter, H. Tactical Recovery Specialist, 457th Group, disbanded. Unit name Ghost Recovery 9. Last seen Battle of Slate Hill. Status presumed Key A. The room fell silent again. Helen unclipped her tag and laid it gently on the planning table. "I'm the only one who made it out, and that's a man I once promised to bring home alive." The tactical map on the screen showed clean digital routes, modern, satellite, fed overlays approved by headquarters. But Helen knew better. She had walked that canyon before, crawled through it with enemy fire overhead. Buried teammates there. She pointed to the screen. "If you send help down this path, you'll lose them. It's the same trap used back in '09. I know a different way, through the North Tunnel cut. It's old. Not on any of your maps." An officer scoffed, with respect. "Ma'am, that's not protocol." Helen didn't argue. She just moved to the whiteboard and started drawing. Emergency escape lines, hidden rock overhangs, natural choke points long since erased from official records. She mapped it like someone recalling her childhood street. Then she looked up. "I don't need command," she said. "I just need clearance. I'll go alone." An hour later, Helen Carter stepped onto the airstrip dressed in her old tactical gear, slightly faded, still precise. She holstered her M9, checked her side compass, and nodded once. Major Donald gave her a single line over comms. "Ghost 7, you're cleared for departure. No fanfare, no medals, just a mission." 2 hours later, her voice crackled over the base radio. "I've made contact. Redirecting Bravo team now." The footage that returned with her would be studied for years. Helen emerged from the tree line, arm under Sergeant Evans' shoulder, guiding him through terrain no drone could read. She didn't fire a single shot. The path she chose, the Old North Cut, bypassed every enemy stronghold and led them to safety like a forgotten thread through time. Evans, barely conscious, looked up at her as the evac chopper landed. "I remember you," he murmured. Helen just nodded. "I told you I'd bring you home." Back at base, Helen didn't return to the command room. She went straight to the kitchen, washed her hands, and started prepping for lunch. When someone called her name, she simply said, "They're safe now." That's all that matters. But everyone who saw her that day knew something had shifted. Her walk, her quiet smile, the way soldiers looked at her, no longer with amusement, but with respect. She was no longer Miss Sandwich. She was the reason 3 men were alive. The next morning, Major Donald reconvened the officers. "This," he said, pointing to the whiteboard, is the new official route for recovery operations, drawn by our kitchen staff. Not a single laugh. Then he reached into his pocket and placed something on the table. An old, weathered patch. Kichosunen, disbanded but never forgotten. Helen didn't take it. I don't need the patch, she said. Just make sure next time someone calls for help, we don't ignore it. She turned to leave, then paused at the doorway. And gentlemen, next time you see someone in an apron, remember? They might be the reason you're still breathing. The door clicked shut behind her. Because some heroes serve quietly and don't need a salute to make history. If you believe that not all uniforms come with stripes, and that some people save lives with no expectation of recognition, leave a comment below. And subscribe to the Veteran Story channel, where the forgotten names like Ghost 9 finally get told. The clatter of ceramic mugs and the smell of warm turkey melts filled the air as Helen Carter entered the operations briefing room, balancing a tray of lunch for the brass. Just like every Thursday, she'd prepared everything by hand: light mustard, no tomato for the major, black coffee, no sugar for the colonel. No one ever thanked her. No one ever remembered. Today, they barely noticed her come in, until the screen behind the planning table lit up. The large monitor at the front of the room displayed a live drone feed. Dust and static crackled over the image as it zoomed in on a firefight unfolding in real time. Bravo team was under ambush, somewhere along the ridges east of Greystone Pass. 3 soldiers were pinned, taking cover behind shattered boulders, their comms intermittent, their ammo low. It was chaos. The officers leaned in, muttering codes and referencing digital maps. One of them, a lieutenant barely out of his 20s, turned to Helen as she set the tray down and said with a grin, "Hope the sandwiches hold up better than Bravo's flank." A few laughed. One even whistled. Helen didn't react. Not at first. She set the tray down gently, smoothed the towel over her wrist, and turned to face the screen. Then her eyes locked onto it, and everything about her changed. She stepped forward slowly, as if being drawn into the image. The room kept talking, but she didn't hear them. The screen showed 3 soldiers crouched low, surrounded by smoke and muzzle flashes. One of them, his helmet cracked, uniform bloodied, was dragging another man with one arm. Helen's breath caught. "That's my unit," she said aloud. The chatter died instantly. "What did you say?" Major Donnell asked, brows furrowing. She didn't blink. "That man, there," she said, pointing with a steady hand. "The one pulling the wounded guy. That's Staff Sergeant Matthew Evans. I carried him out of Fog Ridge once, back when his stomach was torn open by shrapnel. Now, no one moved." Donnell narrowed his eyes. "You know him personally?" Helen nodded. "I didn't just serve with him, I saved his life." A captain sitting at the edge of the table tapped a few keys on the command console, searching personnel records. The room remained frozen as the feed on screen flickered with bursts of radio static, cries for backup, requests for coordinates, desperate shouting over gunfire. Then the search returned a match. "Carter Helen M." The captain reads slowly. "Former Tactical Recovery Unit Ghost 9. Status inactive. Unit disbanded after Slate Hill engagement. Listed as presumed KIA." Heads turned. The room fell into an eerie silence, like a chapel suddenly realizing it had been laughing during a funeral. Helen took a breath, reached beneath her apron, and unclipped the worn silver chain that hung around her neck. She held it out to Donnell, letting the dull tag dangle between her fingers. It read Carter H. Tirtu 457 Raven Protocol. The faded text told a story no one had asked about until now. "I'm the last one left from Ghost 9, she said. "And that man on screen is one of the few I ever got out alive. If he's there, if he's pinned like that, he's not going to make it unless someone who knows those ridges steps in." Someone whispered, "She's the cook?" Helen looked over her shoulder at the junior officer. "And today," she said calmly, "I'm also the only one in this room whose blood on that terrain." The briefing room was never designed for reversals like this. Not in protocol. Not in structure. A civilian logistics staffer stepping forward to call out a tactical trap in front of half the officer corps. Unthinkable. But not one of them could argue with the look in her eyes. She walked over to the tactical board and paused. The updated satellite maps projected pristine terrain grids with clear enemy positions and standard exit routes. "It won't work," she said, scanning it. "This ridge, they've funneled Bravo into an old crossfire pattern, same one used in Slate Hill. If you send reinforcements through this corridor, they'll lose 2 more units before they even get close." Donald didn't argue. He simply asked, "What do you suggest?" Helen stepped up to the board and, with a dry erase marker from the side of the frame, began drawing. She outlined an old emergency evacuation path, the northern cut, a tunnel system and dry creek bed long forgotten and wiped from newer maps. Her hand moved with confidence. She marked fallback points, hidden depressions in the land that offered visual cover, and natural landmarks that weren't visible on satellite images but were burned into her memory. She had crawled through that terrain, once with half a squad bleeding beside her. She knew every stone like an old wound. When she was done, the room stared at the map in silence. Helen turned to Donald. "I can't give orders," she said, "but I can go." "You haven't been in uniform for years," he said. "But I've never stopped being a soldier," she replied. Donald was quiet. Then he turned to the communications officer. "Prep the bird," he said, "and get her what she needs." Helen didn't smile, she didn't celebrate. She simply nodded, picked up her tag, and walked out, no longer just the woman with the sandwiches. She was Ghost 7 again, and Bravo team, still bleeding on that ridge, had just been given a second chance. If this part of the story moved you, stay tuned. Because what Helen does next will rewrite everything they thought they knew about what it means to serve. Some people wear aprons. Some carry guns. And some, like Helen Carter, do both when it matters most. No one moved, no one spoke. Helen Carter stood at the center of the operations briefing room, her eyes still fixed on the screen, where Staff Sergeant Evans and 2 others remained pinned behind jagged rocks in what was quickly becoming a death trap. Smoke drifted across the live drone feed. Their radio comms crackled with bursts of panic, and all around her, men in full uniform, majors, colonels, tacticians, were looking at the woman they had dismissed for years, the woman who had just said, without trembling, "That's my unit." Colonel Donald was the first to break the silence. His voice was low, measured. "Carter, I need you to explain exactly how you know Sergeant Evans." Helen didn't hesitate. With one hand, she reached beneath her apron and unclipped the thin silver chain around her neck, the one she'd worn every day since arriving at Redstone Forward. Her fingers curled gently around the old dog tag at the end. She held it up for all to see. The metal was dulled with time, the engraving half erased by wear, but still visible under the projector light. "Xartar H, TRU 457, Juh Osten," and a murmur swept through the room. The junior officer who had laughed earlier leaned forward, squinting. "Ghost 9. That's not in any active rotation." The room's intelligence officer turned pale. He'd already begun typing into his console, searching military archives. After a moment, he looked up, stunned. Sir Ghost 9 was a tactical recovery unit, classified Tier 2, blacklisted after the engagement at Slate Hill. He paused. They were officially disbanded. No survivors listed. Helen nodded slowly, eyes never leaving the screen. "They listed me as KIA to avoid questions about the mission's failure. Truth is, I walked out alone. No one else made it." She looked down at the tag once more before setting it gently on the operations table, like a relic returning to the altar. "Evans was under my care during that deployment," she continued. "He was green back then, full of heart but no field sense. He caught a piece of shrapnel trying to shield a medic. I carried him 6 miles through hostile terrain, got him on a medevac before I collapsed myself." Donald was quiet for a long moment, his eyes heavy with questions. "Why didn't you come forward sooner?" "I did," Helen said. "Twice. They told me Ghost 9 no longer existed, that I'd be reassigned, quietly. The only choice I was given was to disappear or disrupt the entire chain of command by bringing up a mission no one wanted in the light. So they gave you an apron." Helen smiled faintly. "And a new name on a kitchen roster." The projector hummed quietly behind them, still broadcasting live footage of Bravo team clinging to life. Helen pointed again at the screen. "They're caught in a variation of the same trap we hit at Slate Hill. I recognize the movement patterns. Enemy pressure is pushing them south, right into a rock funnel with no exit. That's why they haven't been able to move. If you try to extract them using these new satellite overlays, you'll send another team straight into the same jaws." The intelligence officer frowned. "But we've updated that region. Those maps are accurate to within 6 inches. Helen looked at him, her voice calm but hard-edged. "You're looking at the land like it's a spreadsheet. I've seen it soaked in blood, with tripwires buried under pine needles and rifle barrels sticking out of foxholes no satellite can detect." She took a step forward, her stance shifting, no longer the posture of a server, but of someone used to standing in briefing rooms where lives hung in the balance. "You want to save them?" she asked. "Then stop looking at that screen like it's a game. Evans is alive right now because he learned something from Slate Hill, but he won't make it out this time unless someone who remembers that terrain gets back in." A long silence filled the room. Then Colonel Donnell slowly walked over to the console and entered an override code. The display on the projector shifted from topographic overlays to manual input. He turned to Helen. "You said you know another route?" She nodded. "The North Cut. It's not on your digital maps because it was decommissioned after the flooding 10 years ago. But I know it's still there. There's an overhang you can slip through. Narrow but passable. Leads to a blind spot behind the ridgeline where they can be pulled out." An officer looked skeptical. "You're saying you want us to trust a recovery path that hasn't been used in a decade?" "No," Helen replied. "I'm saying you don't have a better option. And I've walked it with bullets behind me." Donald studied her for a long moment. He saw no hesitation, no desperation, just certainty. Finally, he nodded to the operations officer. "Pull up legacy map access. Let her draw the route." As Helen stepped forward, the air in the room seemed to change. This wasn't a cook anymore. This was the last living memory of an operation no one dared speak of. A woman forged in a battle so brutal, the military buried the file rather than answer for it. Her fingers traced the route onto the display like it was muscle memory. A side trail, a shallow ravine, a cut through between rock beds that wouldn't appear on a digital map, but could shelter a team for hours. As she worked, no one interrupted her. Even the junior officers could feel it. This wasn't improvisation. This was doctrine. Forgotten, buried, but still alive in her bones. When she finished, she stepped back. "That's the only way I know to get them out alive." Donald didn't blink. "Would you go?" Helen didn't even need to answer. Her eyes said it all. "I'll authorize a temporary field clearance," he said. "We'll outfit you and give you the call sign." Helen turned and retrieved her tag from the table. She looked at it once before sliding it back around her neck. "I already have one," she said softly. "Ghost 7. And with that, the forgotten soldier walked out of the war room, her apron still folded over one arm and her past no longer hidden, but weaponized, ready to save the men she once promised never to leave behind. The room held its breath. Helen Carter stood before the operations screen, her old military tag now back around her neck, no longer hidden beneath the folds of her apron. The silver caught the light, but no one dared make a comment anymore. What had once been a running joke among young officers was now a ghost from the classified past, staring them in the face. Colonel Donnell, arms crossed, motioned for the tactical display to be reset. "You said you recognize this situation," he asked. Helen nodded, stepping forward. "They're walking into a kill box," she said plainly. "I've seen this exact maneuver before. It's what we called wedge and collapse. Enemy forces press the team into a canyon, then cave in behind them. Anyone trying to extract them from the air gets shot down. Anyone who tries to flank through standard satellite routes walks straight into heavy fire. But these are the newest maps," one of the analysts said defensively. "We've got thermal overlays, high-res terrain detail. And they're wrong where it counts." Helen cut in, her voice quiet but sharp. "Those overlays only know what satellites can see. But they don't know what's underneath. They don't remember where men bled." She motioned to a console. "Give me control of the map." Donald gave a single nod. The analyst reluctantly stepped aside. Helen took the digital stylus and began drawing on the terrain projection. Her movements were fast, deliberate, almost mechanical, like her body remembered more than her mind needed to. "This ridge here?" she said, drawing a red X over a clearing. "Looks like open ground." "It's not. Underneath is a collapsed munitions cache from the 2008 operation. Still unstable. If they step on it, it'll blow." She drew again. "And here. This straight line across the ravine. That's a false path. Enemy snipers used it to lure 2 of our men into crossfire. They didn't make it home." Then she paused, exhaled, and slowly began drawing an arcing line from the edge of the map. A barely visible route that curved wide around enemy positions, threading through ridgelines and gulches. "This is the North Stone Tunnel cut," she said. The officers stared. "That's not on any active record," someone muttered. Helen looked up, because it was buried. Literally, after a flood washed out the entry point 10 years ago, Command marked it inaccessible. But it's not collapsed, just hidden. We used it for rapid recovery. Narrow, dark, unstable. But it leads right behind the ridge where Bravo's trapped. If they can hold position for 2 hours, I can reach them. A silence passed over the room again. "You think you can guide a team through a path that hasn't been used in over a decade?" one captain asked. Helen nodded. "I don't think I can. I know I can. I memorized every turn of that route because I had to carry a man on my back through it in the dark, with half a unit behind me bleeding and out of ammo. That path may not be perfect, but it's the only one that keeps them alive." Donald stepped closer. "Do you understand what you're asking? We'd have to reactivate your clearance. Pull archived maps from black tier storage. You'd be operating without comm support once inside the ridge. No backup, no command." Helen's eyes didn't waver. "I'm not asking to be reinstated. I'm telling you that if no one else will go." The colonel looked at her, really looked. The way you only look at someone when rank no longer matters, when uniform doesn't define the worth of a person.
"Why now?"
he asked quietly. After all these years in silence, Helen swallowed hard. "Because I made a promise, not just to Evans, but to the men we lost in Slate Hill. I promised I'd never let that same trap be used again. And right now, Bravo is 5 minutes away from dying in it." Donald glanced at the operations officer. "Activate dormant field status, 1 operator. Codename Ghost 7. A moment passed. Then Helen felt the shift. The air around her changed. The subtle hum of the room went quiet. Officers began pulling up the old files. A combat medic fetched her tactical harness from storage. An assistant returned from the archives with her sidearm, still logged under her name. The M9 was worn but well kept. She loaded it without a word. As she tightened the straps on her flak vest, one of the younger officers approached sheepishly. "Ma'am, do you want a guide?" Helen looked at him with something close to a smile. "You can't guide what you've never walked." She pulled on her boots, the same model she'd worn all those years ago, and slipped her dog tag into her vest pocket. Not hidden this time, carried with pride. As she approached the waiting helicopter, the blades already spinning, Colonel Donald met her at the edge of the tarmac. He handed her a folded patch, worn, Ghost 9. She didn't take it. "I'm not going for the patch," she said quietly. "I'm going because they're still my unit, whether the papers say so or not." With that, Helen climbed aboard. The door closed behind her with a thud, and the bird lifted off into the gray horizon. Down below, the war room stood still. Up in the air, a woman with no rank, no orders, and no backup flew straight toward the valley she once barely escaped. Because someone down there was calling for help, and she still remembered the way in. And more importantly, she remembered the way out. The moment Helen Carter stepped onto the tarmac, the noise around her faded into memory. She was no longer the woman who scrubbed steel counters and made sandwiches with quiet grace. She was something else now, something the younger soldiers had only read about in blacked-out files and heard whispered through back-channel comms. Her hair was pulled tight, her flak vest resecured, and the old sidearm, the worn M9 issued years ago, rested against her right hip like it had never left. No one tried to stop her. No one dared. She carried no rank. She'd received no orders. But when she strapped herself into the jump seat of the unmarked bird and gave the signal for liftoff, not a single officer questioned it. They all just watched. The rotors cut into the sky as the UH-72 Lakota lifted off the pad, climbing into the haze of a gray Tennessee morning. Behind Helen, Redstone Base shrank into the backdrop. Ahead of her, the ridgelines twisted into jagged silence, unchanged from the last time she'd crawled through them. Slate-colored, wind-scarred, and haunted by memories, her radio headset crackled once. Ghost 7? This is base command, en route status confirmed. Helen pressed the button once in reply. That was all. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. For the next hour and 40 minutes, she sat in complete silence, knees locked, fingers tapping lightly on her thigh. Her mind wasn't here, not really. It had already crossed into the valley, already felt the crunch of dry pine needles beneath her boots, already remembered the way Evans had looked 10 years ago, when she dragged him, barely breathing, through this same terrain. The past never left, not when the terrain remembered your footsteps. As the chopper curved around the western ridge, Helen pointed to the tree line. The pilot didn't argue. He dipped low, just enough to drop her without being picked up on enemy thermal scans. The moment her boots hit the ground, the bird peeled away, vanishing into cloud cover. She was alone, and she moved like she'd never left. No GPS, no drone guidance, just memory and muscle. Helen's steps were deliberate but fast. Every curve in the path, every sloping hollow, was a checkpoint in her mind. She crouched low through thickets of dry brush, weaving past long-forgotten stone formations, crawling under downed trunks still blackened from fires long since cooled. The radio came to life with static. Then a whisper, "Base, this is Ghost 7. I've reached the forest edge, moving in." In the command center back at Redstone, the room froze. Even the junior officers, those who had laughed at her just days before, stood motionless. No one spoke. No one breathed. Donald leaned forward. "Copy that, Ghost 7. Bravo team last confirmed at Ridge Delta 6. No visual since Zo4 17 hours. Helen gave one click. Understood. She pressed forward. 40 minutes later, crouched behind a slanted rock outcrop, she found them. 3 men, one unconscious, one limping, sidearm bloody, and Evans still standing, barely, eyes darting, scanning for any sign of rescue. Until he saw her. His weapon dropped an inch, his mouth parted. Helen stepped from cover like a shadow returning to the earth. Evans blinked. He didn't finish. Helen gave a half smile. "You always did get yourself in the worst places." He almost laughed. "You came back." She didn't answer. She simply crouched, checked the wounds, wrapped the leg of the injured corporal, and slid a terrain map from her vest. "We'll go north. The old cut's still there." Evans whispered, "That tunnel's been closed for years." Helen glanced at him. "Not to me." And then they moved, she led. Evans supported the wounded. The last man, barely conscious, was slung between them. Every step was calculated. Helen paused before every bend, every slope. She knew where the old sniper nests used to be, knew which trees had root pockets big enough to hide claymores. She led them through a landscape that had once been hell, and today became their salvation. Not a single shot was fired. She moved with precision that no modern recon drone could replicate. Where AI algorithms predicted risk, Helen already knew which paths meant death and which could cradle life. By the time they reached the extraction point, an open plateau covered in moss and quiet air, dusk had begun to settle. The helicopter arrived 3 minutes later. Evans, barely able to stand, looked back at her as medics rushed in. "I remember you," he whispered, a mixture of disbelief and gratitude in his voice. Helen gently helped him into the rescue harness. "I told you," she said softly. "I'd always bring you home." As the chopper lifted, Helen didn't climb aboard. She stepped back into the trees. She didn't need to be in the photo. She didn't need her name listed in the after-action report. She just needed to finish the job, quietly. Only when the blades disappeared over the ridge did she turn and begin walking back down the path alone. Back at Redstone, the command center erupted in motion as Bravo's vitals came through. The officers cheered, high-fived, slapped shoulders. Donald, however, stood quietly at the edge of the screen. The final radio ping had come through just before the chopper departed. Ghost 7. Objective complete. No one ever forgot the sound of that voice. The same voice that once took lunch orders now echoed like the final page of a forgotten chapter. Helen Carter, the cook they had laughed at, had just walked through hostile terrain alone, and brought back 3 men, without losing a single one. No medals, no headlines. Just a woman with a memory sharper than any satellite, and a heart stubborn enough to return to where she'd nearly died. Because when her people needed her, she didn't need permission. She just needed a way in. The moss under Helen Carter's boots was damp, but it cushioned every step. She moved without a word, eyes scanning each ridge, each bend in the earth. Not for threats, but for memories. Behind her, 3 soldiers followed. One limped, his left pant leg soaked with blood. Another, barely conscious, leaned against Evans, who kept glancing at Helen's back like he was still trying to understand who, or what, she was. But Helen didn't look back. She didn't need to. She knew every inch of this path. Years ago, it had nearly taken her life. Now it was the only way she could save theirs. The sky overhead dimmed to slate gray as they entered the last half-mile of the North Stone Tunnel cut. A forgotten ravine once marked as unstable, now their lifeline. To any drone overhead, it was invisible, buried under thickets and years of erosion. But to Helen, it was as clear as the lines on her hand. She guided them under the remains of a fallen pine, then held out a hand. Flat, silent. The group froze. She turned her head slightly. "Watch your left," she whispered. "It's hollow under the moss. One wrong step and you'll fall into the ravine." Evans adjusted the wounded man's arm and nodded. They stepped around it carefully. Not a word spoken. Not a twig snap. Not a sound made beyond the wind and the rustling of uniforms brushing against rock and leaf. Helen moved like a ghost, but not one lost. One returning, with a mission, with resolve, with unfinished business. 10 minutes later, they reached the clearing. It was quiet, too quiet. Evans looked around. "You sure this is it?" Helen knelt by a moss-covered boulder, brushing away dirt until her fingers found it, a rusted metal bolt. She smiled faintly. "It's still here." She pressed her palm against the stone, shifting its weight with practiced ease. Beneath it, an old steel panel revealed itself, the top of a makeshift signal marker built into the field during Ghost 9 operations. Even now, the circuitry flickered to life with a dull green glow. A signal was sent. The evac bird would be there in 4 minutes. Evans helped the corporal sit down on a dry patch of earth and crouched beside Helen. He looked at her, really looked, for the first time. "I remember you now," he said softly, almost like he didn't trust the memory. "You pulled me out of Fog Ridge. I was bleeding bad. You wrapped me in your jacket and said..." Helen finished the sentence for him. "I'll get you home." He nodded slowly. His voice caught as he said it again. "You said you'd bring me home." Helen's eyes didn't leave his. She didn't offer a speech. She didn't make a scene. She just gave a quiet, knowing smile. "I did." They sat in silence, the air heavy with relief and disbelief. No one had fired a single shot. No one had died. And yet, they all knew it could have gone the other way. Had she not remembered the land, the turns, the traps, the ghosts? Had she not chosen to act? The helicopter appeared in the distance as a low thrum, growing louder. Helen stood and waved the coded signal. The pilot circled once and dipped low, rotor wash bending the grass in waves. Medics jumped down and rushed to the wounded. Evans stood last, still watching her. "You're not coming back with us." Helen shook her head. "Not on that bird." He looked as if he wanted to say something more, something meaningful, maybe even heroic. But the moment didn't need words. It had already said everything. He boarded the chopper, eyes never leaving her, and when it lifted off, the sun catching its belly just as it rose above the ridge, Helen remained standing beneath it, one hand still raised. In the command center back at Redstone, the radio crackled once more. Ghost 7. Extraction complete. All accounted for. The officers didn't cheer. They didn't move. They just stood in silence, not out of confusion, but out of awe. A mission that had been deemed too late, too far gone, too dangerous, had ended with every soldier alive, thanks to a woman they'd once called just the cook. When Helen made her way back to the base hours later, boots muddy, vest dusty, pistol untouched, no one asked where she'd gone. They already knew. They'd seen the footage. They'd heard the silence where gunfire should have been. They'd seen the impossible get done, without a single command being given. And some part of them, the part trained to recognize what couldn't be taught, knew they'd just witnessed something rare. Not loud, not official, but real. Victory without violence. Precision without orders. Courage without spectacle. That night, Helen sat alone in the kitchen again, peeling potatoes like she always had, apron back on, sleeves rolled up. But even the young recruits who used to tease her didn't dare speak. They walked slower near her, stood a little straighter, because they knew what Evans now knew. The quietest one in the room had been the one who brought them all home. By the time the helicopter touched down at Redstone Forward, dusk had given way to early night. The lights on the tarmac glowed dimly through a haze of dust and exhaust. Inside the command center, no one dared speak above a whisper. The screen had gone dark after the last transmission, but its final message lingered in every mind. Ghost 7. Extraction complete. All accounted for. The mission was over. Not one bullet fired. Not one man left behind. And Helen Carter, who, hours earlier, had been dismissed as the cook, had walked into hostile terrain alone, navigated a forgotten escape route from memory, and brought Bravo Team home intact. But Helen didn't return to the command center. She didn't walk in for a debriefing, didn't demand acknowledgement, didn't ask for applause. She walked across the tarmac, boots still caked with earth from the same ridgeline that had nearly claimed her life 10 years ago. Her vest was zipped up to her chin, the old dog tag tucked back beneath it. Her steps were even, her posture calm, and she made her way directly to the kitchen. The overhead lights in the galley flickered softly as she stepped inside. The smell of garlic and onions lingered faintly from earlier prep. Without a word, she turned on the sink, rolled up her sleeves, and began to wash her hands. Hot water, steam rising. She scrubbed slowly, deliberately, as if washing off more than just dirt, maybe time itself. It wasn't until she reached for a clean towel that she noticed the silence behind her. 5 soldiers stood at the entrance to the kitchen. Not one of them spoke. Not one of them moved. They just watched. One of them, Private Hastings, barely 20, opened his mouth as if to say something, then closed it. His usual smirk was gone. His posture straightened. Helen nodded once in acknowledgement. Not a greeting, not permission, just a quiet understanding that the air between them had changed. She grabbed a clean pot, filled it with water, and set it on the stove. Breakfast prep would take hours, and there was always work to be done. But from that night forward, something was different. The soldiers who used to call her Miss Sandwich now addressed her as Mom, without irony. The lieutenants who once ignored her presence in the hall now stepped aside with a subtle nod. Even the loudest voices in the mess line softened when she passed. And perhaps most telling, no one ever asked what happened out there, because they already knew. They had seen the after-action footage. They'd seen the route drawn in chalk that modern maps had forgotten. They'd seen Sergeant Evans limp into the medical bay whispering, "She came back," just like she promised. That whisper traveled through the entire base faster than any memo. Helen Carter had returned from the dead, not in body but in meaning. The woman they thought they knew had become something else entirely, a living memory of sacrifice, of precision, of courage wrapped in silence. She still arrived every morning at 400 a.m. She still prepped each meal by hand. But now, the soldiers paused when they saw her in the corner of the mess hall. They watched the way she stirred broth, the way she sharpened knives, the way she moved through steam and stainless steel like a ghost slipping between worlds. It was a strange kind of reverence, not loud, not public, but deeply real. Once, she had served them eggs and toast. Now they understood she had once served under fire, and had returned only when no one else could. Colonel Donnell said nothing, but he made sure one thing changed. A small silver nameplate appeared on the kitchen door 2 days later. No rank, no title, just 4 words etched clean and simple: Carter H., Ghost 7. She never commented on it, never asked who approved it. She just kept working. And yet even the new recruits knew. This wasn't a joke or some honorary plaque. It was a quiet warning that somewhere in this base, the woman who handed you a sandwich might also be the one who memorized escape paths no drone could see. That the person sweeping the floor might carry the burden of brothers lost and promises kept in silence. And that sometimes the one you overlook is the only one who can bring you home. The next time Evans walked into the galley, bandages still on his ribs. He waited at the end of the line until the room emptied out. Then, tray in hand, he stood across the counter from her. She looked up. He didn't speak right away. He didn't need to. He placed a folded cloth napkin on the counter. Inside it was her Raven 9 patch. "I found it," he said. "It was still in my old vest. From back then." Helen looked at it, fingers brushing the edges, frayed, faded, forgotten by most. She didn't put it on. She folded it back into the napkin and handed it back to him. "Keep it," she said, "so you don't forget who you are." Evans nodded, and that was all. The next morning, Helen was back at the sink, humming faintly under her breath, flipping bacon for men who now understood what the price of peace really looked like. It didn't wear medals. It wore an apron and remembered the way home. The door closed behind Helen Carter with a soft but unmistakable click. No final salute, no applause, no commendation, and yet the weight of her words, "Maybe don't assume that's all they ever carried," still hung in the air like smoke after a battle. No one moved. Colonel Donnell remained at the head of the table, one hand resting over the Ghost 9 patch tucked back into his breast pocket, as if guarding something sacred. Around him, officers stared down at their notepads, at the still, glowing tactical map, or at the untouched cups of coffee she had quietly placed just moments earlier. But no one looked at each other. They couldn't. Not yet. Because they had just been reminded of something so obvious, so fundamental, that it cut deeper than any after-action report. They had misjudged her. All of them. For years, Helen Carter had walked among them in silence, apron tied neatly, hair pulled back, eyes lowered. She'd listened while they joked, served them food while they dismissed her, moved through their world unnoticed, all while carrying the kind of history that made their ribbons look like decoration. And she had never once tried to correct them, never once reached for validation. Instead, she waited. Waited for the one moment that truly mattered. And when it came, when 3 men's lives depended on it, she stepped forward. Not with demands, not with bitterness, but with knowledge, with action, with the kind of calm born only of experience soaked in loss. She hadn't needed orders. She had only needed a reason. Later that evening, long after the lights in the operations center dimmed and the base returned to its usual rhythm, Helen stood alone in the kitchen. The metal counters gleamed. The dish racks were empty. A pot of stew simmered low on the back burner, quiet, steady. She stood there, looking out the small square window above the sink. Beyond it, the distant tree line was still. She knew those woods now more intimately than ever. The sounds, the paths, the memories. But the battlefield wasn't out there anymore. It was here. In this quiet room, in the mess hall, in the places where people assumed you were nothing because you didn't look like something. That's where the real fight was. The fight to be seen. The fight to stay human. And sometimes, the fight to act when no one else was watching. A few moments later, the door opened gently behind her. It was Private Hastings, the same recruit who used to crack jokes when she served pasta. Tonight, he didn't say anything. He simply stepped forward, placed a folded note on the counter and whispered, "Thank you." Helen nodded. That was enough. Because it wasn't about forgiveness. It was about understanding. The next morning, every soldier on base showed up early to breakfast. Some out of hunger, but most out of something else entirely. Respect. They waited quietly as Helen served. No shouting, no rushed trays, just quiet nods, quiet ma'ams, and 1 or 2 whispered, "I'm glad you were there." Evans sat alone at the back of the mess hall. He watched her for a long time before he finally said it aloud. To no one in particular. She saved us without ever lifting a weapon. And that was the truth. Helen Carter had walked through hell twice. Once when she lost her unit. And again, when she chose to walk back in, all without anyone ever seeing her coming. Until it was too late not to notice. There are people in this world who don't ask to be recognized. They don't chase medals. They don't tell stories at the bar or post about their past. They just carry it, like Helen did, quietly, steadily, and with a kind of dignity most of us forget even exists. We live in a time when appearance often matters more than substance, when the loudest voice is mistaken for the most capable one. But there's a truth older than uniforms and older than protocol. The strongest people are often the quietest in the room. So the next time you see someone in an apron, someone pushing a mop, someone carrying a tray, pause. Ask yourself, what else have they carried that you'll never see? Because heroes don't always show up in armor. Sometimes they wear hairnets. Sometimes they serve coffee. And sometimes they save lives before you even realize they were ever in the room. Leave a comment for the Helens of the world, the quiet ones, the forgotten ones, the ones who never needed praise to do the impossible. Have you ever met someone who carried more than they let on? Tell us their story. Subscribe, where the quietest voices finally get heard. Because legends don't always need a spotlight. Sometimes they just need to be remembered.